we're in the middle, right? It already started, I think. Not yet. March 1st. Okay,
Yeah.
so not quite yet, but we're coming up on it. Okay, so yeah, I am presenting what will be a chapter in my second book, and I'll talk a little bit more later about how that fits into it. But I thought I'd start right in. I was first introduced to, there we go, okay. I was first introduced to the shamans at Tengri through Professor Dashanima Dugarov in 2002. I had received Title VI FLAS funding to study Buryat at BGU, the Buryat State University, and my teacher, Tsimjit Badmajapovna, introduced me to Professor Dugarov as an esteemed scholar of Buryat shamanism. He's like, oh, you're interested in shamanism? I have some people you need to meet. So he took me down into the older district of the city where the old wooden houses still are, and he introduced me to two men. This one is Buryat Podvoyevich, and that is Viktor Darjevich. And they were setting up a shamans organization called Tengri in a tiny, tiny little 2-room office that you reach through somebody's backyard. This isn't even that, like the original one was even smaller than this. This is the backyard of the second office that they had. This was from the inauguration of their second office. And it has since grown into one of the largest, most active, and sometimes one of the more controversial Buryat shamanic organizations. And along the way, both of them, Buryat and Viktor Darjevich, have both left the organization and founded new ones of their own. The current director of Tengri, Buryat Shambhalovich, has built a very large complex on the outside of town. Oh, I guess I just click on it. Okay. And so this is actually a donation box and the plans that he had drawn up for the shamanic worship center or the Tengri spiritual complex that he wanted to build outside of the city. So, and you could, leave money to, build this eventually. So they have very, very big dreams and aspirations. And Buryat Shambhalovich has now realized those. They've built a pretty large complex on the outside of town, complete with several temples, and they post videos of rituals on Instagram and YouTube. So those were the plans. This is the office as it was in 2012. It's since probably grown considerably. So you get a sense from this, right? This isn't your so-called like grandfather's shamanism, right? This is a group of educated urban shamans who are building an institution. They worked to get state registration as a traditional religious organization. They were allocated land by the city, and they aspire to be recognized as a universal religion. They see themselves as in competition with Buddhism and not so much with Christianity, but nonetheless, like as a properly recognized, state-recognized religious institution. And although they're probably the most active organization right now, they were neither the first organization in Buryatia. There are now several organizations, and there are also comparable shamanic organizations in Tuva and the Sakha Republic. Right? So this isn't just a one-off. This is a trend in how shamanism developed after the fall of the Soviet Union. But 2002 was still the very early days, and they were just beginning to imagine that institution that they hoped to build. And I'm pretty sure they were willing to talk to me, and in fact, gave me a written invitation to return to their annual Tailgan and Shamanic Naучно-практические конференции, which I included in my Fulbright Hays application. And I'm pretty sure they were willing to do that because Professor Dugarov vouched for me. So this is actually Professor Dugarov right here. And there's Buryat Podvoyevich and Viktor Darjevich. This was at Tailgan out at the Hippodrome in Verkhny Berezovki. They would justify and explain their distinction between Black and white shamanism by referring to his book, They told me that they wanted to collaborate with scholars because they didn't have the time to devote to the academic aspects of shamanic revival, but they thought it was really important. And for most Buryats who are interested in learning, or many Buryats interested in learning more about ancestral forms of shamanism, especially urban shamans, one of their main sources of information were academic studies published by Buryat historians and ethnographers from about the 1970s through the mid-90s. And in the immediate post-Soviet period, in the early 1990s, many of those same scholars who had published earlier were looking to shamanism and kind of touting shamanism as having the potential to provide a cultural ideology that could revive the Buryat nation and fill the so-called ideological vacuum that most of us remember being so talked about at the time. Several scholars, notably Valentin Khagdayev and Irina Urbanayeva, left academia to become shamans themselves. Khagdayev is featured in Anya Bernstein's movie In Pursuit of the Siberian Shaman, which she did as part of a master's degree here in the anthropology department at NYU. So I thought I should make that connection. He was a graduate student in the early 90s and eventually became sort of the main shaman of Olkhon Island. Urbanayeva began her career as a professor of atheism in a department of philosophy. She left that job to study to become a shaman, but eventually took vows as a Buddhist nun and founded the Green Tara Society, which was the first women's Buddhist organization in Buryatia. So we have scholars becoming shamans, we have aspiring shamans reading academic literature as sources for what they're trying to do. And that raised, for me, the question of what was going on in the 70s and 80s, that an officially atheist state was paying the salaries of academics who were researching national and religious practices that the state was actively trying to suppress. And further, how did that institutional context under which all that material was produced shape the way in which post-Soviet shamans think about what they do when they start rebuilding what they're doing? And to be perfectly honest, I don't have like a clear and easy answer. This talk is part of an ongoing book project that's looking at asking how Soviet secularism shaped the post-Soviet Buryat shamanic revival, and trying to take very seriously the way in which shamanism is affected by historical processes. A lot of academic and popular culture, especially popular culture in both the West and the former Soviet Union, tends to think about indigenous religious practices as the opposite of modernity, right? As primitive superstition, or conversely, as valuable ancient wisdom. And because of that, we often don't ask, how is it affected by historical processes? So that's why I'm interested in looking at this material. To spell out the a priori assumptions behind this project, the Soviet Union wanted to create an atheist state. But as we all know, it failed. And in trying but failing to eradicate religion, it acted an awful lot like a secular state. It made compromises, it made agreements, it disciplined religions in certain ways. So I think, although we wouldn't necessarily call it a secular state, it acts like one, and therefore I think makes for a very interesting comparison. And I define secularism, following Assad and Mahmoud, as a political project that seeks to discipline religious practices and institutions to render them compatible with the sovereignty of a state. Usually we think of a secular state, but in this case, the Soviet atheist state. And there have been a number of histories of how the Russian Orthodox Church or Baptists or Central Asian Muslims have interacted with the Soviet state, and in turn were shaped by those interactions. So I want to ask that question about shamanism. It's a different kind of task, however, because shamanism is a little bit of a different kind of a practice. Right? Shamanic institutions were often invisible to the Soviet state, and that was usually a good thing because it meant that people could hide their practices much more easily than if you have a seminary and a temple. But it also means that we don't have an easy archive to turn to, right? It's difficult to know how to look for that information. And shamanic practices were differently affected than religions with buildings and seminaries and texts, right? So it's harder to imagine and figure out how they were affected by these particular practice, the suppression and also the disciplinary actions of the state, right? How does that shape it? It's going to shape it differently than it will for an institution that has a much more visible institutional form. And so I'll say shamans have told me that between the purges and World War II and the fact that people hid their practices so that they wouldn't endanger their relatives, the entire tradition was lost and has to be recreated solely from texts and communications from ancestors. Everything was gone, right? In different contexts, the same people have told me that people always practiced shamanism, that Buryats need shamanism, people need shamans. And many people have told me the same thing that Buddhists have. If something has roots, you can cut it down, but as long as the roots are still there, it will grow back. And it seems like in the early 1990s, one of the main taproots for the revival of shamanic practices was academic literature produced in the late Soviet period by the Russian Academy of Sciences, published by the Russian Academy of Sciences by Buryat scholars who were trained as Soviet scientists. And it is fun to think about how authoritarian states undermine their own authority, and that is definitely going on here. But I'm also interested in what kind of traces and forms that leaves behind in the practices that grow out of those texts. And the project is a little bit similar to Catherine Verdery's project in National Ideology Under Socialism, which is like a classic now. I want to take very seriously the interplay between the legitimating discourses of Soviet institutions and the way in which intellectual work can, to paraphrase her, quote, serve the existing system of power, but also be a locus for forming alternative consciousnesses, and that seemingly oppositional activity often congeal the legitimating premises of rule, even when their participants intend otherwise. Unlike Romania, which was Verdery's focus, Buryat scholars did not have an independent nation to look back at, nor did their nationalist project achieve post-Soviet independence. Moreover, unlike one might argue in the Sakha Republic, shamanism never really achieved the status of national religion, in part because of competition from the Buddhist Sangha, and also because, I think, because shamanism doesn't really look like an ideology. It is, as the Buryat scholar Mikhailov said, a consciousness embedded in practices and rituals. And it doesn't work well as an ideology. I don't want to say it doesn't have one, right? But it's hard to recognize. So I see a lot of people in the audience who might know something about Buryatia, so forgive me if this is repeating stuff that you already know. I was planning to give a little bit of historical context. So this is a map, obviously, of Russia, and as a result of Tibetan Buddhist missionizing, and you can see, right, Buryatia on the map is right north of Mongolia. Buryatia had been part of a broader Tibetan Buddhist intellectual world that spanned Tibet, outer and inner Mongolia, and into the Qing Empire, as well as the Kalmuk Mongols in the West, since the 17th century, producing sort of a pan-Mongolian, pan-Buddhist intellectual circle. And then a prolific but very small secular Buryat intelligentsia began to develop in the mid to late 19th century as increasing numbers of Buryats were educated in Russian academic institutions. And this past fall, I was lucky enough to attend the Buryat Studies Conference that your very own Tatiana Linkoeva organized. And there is just a ton of fascinating work being done about that period. And to sum it up very briefly, under that, the influence of Western colonialism, the end of the Qing, the establishment of an independent Mongolia, nationalist ideas became very widespread in the area at the time. And this small but vibrant group of Buryat nationalist intellectuals, they saw Buddhism as the natural choice for a national religion around which Buryat national identity and nationalist aspirations could form. And at the time, that made perfect sense because most of them were themselves Buddhists. the transnational spread of ideas was facilitated by Buddhist monastic systems. Buddhism had long been considered more civilized than shamanism. And as scholars, this is something that Bernstein writes about, they were valuable to the Russian Empire in part because they had native access to Tibet, right? So their Buddhism made them valuable to the colonial empire. And because Tibet was this object of Western intellectual and colonial fascination. And those nationalist aspirations continued after the formation of the Buryat Mongolian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1923. But unfortunately, most of the intellectuals who survived into the Soviet years were killed during the Stalinist purges. So there's a bit of a historical gap then in scholarship. There is some intellectual work going on during the purges in World War II and immediately afterwards, but under those circumstances, it's not a lot, right? And a lot of it is just setting the stage and building institutions that eventually become very vibrant sources of intellectual life later. In the 1960s, which is when we're gonna shift to. So the generation that I'm really focusing on were educated and worked within Soviet institutions that had been fostered by Soviet nationality policies. It was a relatively small group of people, mostly centered in Ulan-Ude, which is the capital, and most worked at what later came to be the Ulan-Ude branch of the Siberian division of the Russian Academy of Sciences. So this particular picture is of the manuscript repository in Ulan-Ude. There's a bigger building that's much less pretty next to it. And the Institute was actually originally founded in 1922 by the Buryat Mongolian Scholars Committee. And it was reformed and renamed at least 4 times before being brought under the auspices of the Russian Academy of Sciences in, I believe, 1958. Not everybody worked there, but it was definitely like the heart of scholarship. There's also Kraevechesky, so a regional history museum, and the Pedagogical Institute that eventually became the Buryat State University. There are a number of other schools. But it's a small group of people, and a lot of them had appointments at multiple institutions. So they all knew each other. They were appointed in various different institutions. They worked together. A lot of the older generation had studied in Moscow and Leningrad and returned to Ulan-Ude to build these institutions. And then after Perestroika in 91, the academic positions they had gave them sort of symbolic capital to be able to make claims about Buryat culture. And as well, in the sort of chaotic post-Soviet economy, where official jobs might or might not actually pay a salary, and everybody was looking to make some money by publishing something, and nobody really checked if you were doing your job because they weren't paying you anyway. All the people that were doing both academic scholarship and sort of national and religious revival tended to be the same group of people. But unlike that earlier turn of the century generation of scholars, they were looking to shamanism rather than to Buddhism to fill that supposed ideological vacuum that fell once the Soviet Union collapsed. Obviously, Buddhism is still a force in the Republic. There is still a traditional Sangha. It was also in the process of building itself back up as an institution and trying very hard to make claims as the national religion of the Buryats. So Buddhism is definitely still there and a force, but I think it's really interesting that this group of academic scholars that are doing conferences about the spiritual rebirth of the nation are really seem to be really focused on shamanism rather than Buddhism. And that's a big switch from the earlier sort of group and the longer history. So I'm sort of interested in that shift, right? What rendered shamanism compelling in a way that it wasn't to that earlier generation? And I think some of that has to do with the influence of Soviet secularism. I think a lot of it has to do with that. Okay, so previously to this, like 20s and 1930s into the 50s, this tends to be the primary way of explaining shamanism according to a historical materialist view, right? Most of these earlier texts argue, right, most of them were drawn from fieldwork done by both Buryat and Russian scholars before the Soviet period. And they analyzed shamanism through the lens of class relations. So the argument is that there's this earlier layer of clan-based rituals that were conducted by elders. Oh, and I messed up the spacing. In a stage where there aren't really class divisions, right? There's just the elders and the family do the clan rituals, and there's no classes. Then feudal society, like where it's developed into a feudal society, and the clan elders become like aristocracy, and shamans become a separate class of ritual specialists. And because they make their living off of conducting rituals and getting payments for conducting rituals, which obviously, according to Marx, is just an illusion, they're an exploitative class. They live off the labor of others, so they are in effect kulaks. And then obviously after that, socialism and the Bolsheviks come in and they liberate people from the oppression of shamans and aristocrats and produce happy socialist society. And just to sort of illustrate that, this is a great propaganda poster about not letting shamans and kulaks into your native. This is not from Buryatia, this is from farther north, but you know, don't let them into your village, Soviet. And thereby convince the natives to become marries the shaman's daughter. There are numerous stories like this that I've seen. And so you can see sort of here some of the illustrations. This is from Bezbožnik. Should we wait for?
Yeah, is it okay now? Yeah.
It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I didn't realize that the internet was out. Okay. Anyway, you can sort of see that illustrated in this. This is an illustration from one of those stories, right? You have the shaman with his drum and the young, like, Bolshevik activist saying stuff. So this is the story that's being told up until about the mid-50s. And then in 1954, the Central Committee decrees that the social sciences should play a role in cultivating atheist worldviews. And that comes from the fact that by the 1950s, an entire generation had been raised according to Soviet values, and yet religious practices still persisted. And that's not just puzzling, it's an embarrassment. So the new goal is to understand religion so that its influence can be effectively countered. Interestingly enough, Victoria Smolkin, who's a colleague of mine, has a fabulous book on the history of atheism from the center. Weirdly enough, a lot of former priests ended up working for the anti-religious propaganda offices. So they knew what they were talking about. So basically, if Stalin's anti-religious campaign was sort of a hammer or a blunt instrument, Khrushchev's was intended to be a scalpel, right? We have to figure out exactly what's going on there so we can get rid of it. And so atheist cadres began asking what it was that religion provided and arguing that socialism had to provide an alternative, right? This is when they really started producing Soviet rituals earlier, like weddings and baptisms and like inauguration into the Lenin Scouts and, you know, all of these things to replace rituals that had started earlier, but it really, really intensifies at this point. And sociologists and ethnographers begin to conduct research on existing practices, partially to understand how to get rid of them, but also in order for anti-religious propagandists to be able to take some of that material to produce popular rituals. And in Buryatia, at least, they were joined by, these ethnographers were also joined by historians and religious studies specialists. Believers are represented less as enemies, and instead as those whom the Soviet system had failed to convince. And in the mid-1960s, these journals like Nauka y Religie, which was the centerpiece of this new, more intellectual, anti-religious propaganda, right? This is Yuri Gagarin leading us into the future. They started, interestingly enough, representing shamanism as a form of a human biological capacity to experience trance states. Which is a massive shift in how shamanism is being represented. So this is an illustration. There's lots of these articles, not a ton, but quite a few. This is an illustration where you have the oracle at Delphi on one side and a shaman on the other. And these are both like examples of the same kind of mystical trance ability. They be compared to Swedenborg, like lots of different options. And it coincides with a broader turn in the 1960s, both in the West and in Russia. There's like this fascination with the esoteric, with the mystical, the occult, new age practices. And this weirdly happens on both sides of the Iron Curtain at around the same time. I could talk endlessly about this. I won't. We can go into it in the Q&A if you're interested. But this is all really important sort of federal level background for what's happening in Ulan-Ude. These changes in anti-religious policy and propaganda at the federal level meant that the academic study of religion had increased ideological justification and institutional support. And I mean, we've all seen in recent days, right? Like funding is really important. Where does the money go? So as I said, in 1958, the local research institute in Ulan-Ude, right, that local research institute was brought into the Russian Academy of Sciences, which most likely meant greater oversight, but it also meant greater access to resources. And indigenous intellectuals, so local Buryat intellectuals, were able to leverage their close cultural and geographic ties to their informants in order to compete with scholars from Moscow. There's still a lot of complicated power relations, but it's a slightly different field because actually being able to be right there and do research matters now in a way that it didn't before. So inadvertently, in the process of all of this, so they finally have a little bit more money. They have access to the research that's becoming more interesting to the center. And also local intellectuals were sometimes sent to these international post-colonial conferences as part of the Comintern. And it was meant to sort of show off how great things were for minority nationalities in the Soviet Union. And like showcased how progressive Soviet nationality policies were when compared to the capitalist West. So inadvertently, the Soviet Union trained a generation of Buryat nationalists who were poised to become resources on Buryat history and culture and religion when the Soviet Union ended. And because they all knew each other, it's fairly reasonable to assume that what they published was a pale reflection of what they were talking about around their kitchen tables. Which of course we don't have access to, right? I really only have access to what they published. Although some of what I'm drawing on here and working through, this is a very embarrassing photo, what I looked like before I was chair of our department. I do also have interview data with Ksenia Maximovna Gerasimova, who is, so this is Ksenia Gerasimova. Her life illustrates the sort of like that whole period. Her mother was a fervent Bolshevik, but also an intellectual. She defended a dissertation on Buddhism in Leningrad in like the 1950s. Was hired probably by the KGB to keep an eye on Caroline Humphrey when she went to do her field work. She told me about that, right? And she returned to work at the Institute in Ulan-Ude. And so she told me lots of interesting things, part of which I'm still working through, right? But she had been part of an extensive survey conducted by the Buryat branch of the Academy of Sciences in rural areas in the early 1970s. And apparently, according to her, the survey results were too scandalous to publish because religious practices were so widespread that they thought they'd get in trouble if they reported it. And she thought the results are still somewhere in a closet at the Academy of Sciences. And was like, you should go look for them. So someone should go look for them. I never did. And apparently, right, she and Taras Mikhailov, who is one of the authors I'm going to talk about, right, had like long debates about how to do the most effective field work. So the woman sitting next to her is Margarita Baronova, who was at that point the chair of the history department at BGU. So there's this generation of local scholars that had been trained in the center. They come back and they trained like a whole generation of the people that are currently running most of these institutes. So there's like this sort of genealogy things that you can trace here. But when you look at the texts, and that's what we're going to do next, you can see that what they were willing and able to publish sort of changed and expanded over time. Even when people were doing field work, as obviously Mikhailov and Gerasimov and a lot of people were doing field work, but they weren't publishing a lot of it initially. Most of the written text, so I've been reading through these ethnographies and histories that were published in the 70s through the 90s. And the people who were writing and publishing them tended to draw heavily on archival, secondary historical, and archaeological sources rather than fieldwork. Even though we know they were doing fieldwork, they weren't really publishing it. Or they were publishing it but not attributing it. It's not quite clear. But they were drawing on materials collected by those same Buryat scholars in the late 19th and early 20th century, that first generation of Buryat nationalists, which allowed them to both present shamanism as something that existed before the Soviet Union, right? It's way back in the past, but it also validates and publicizes a long history of Buryat scholarship that goes precisely contrary to the prevailing Soviet narrative that the Soviet Union brought civilization and education to Siberia. So one of the first books is this one over here. I'm sorry, it's a little fuzzy. Manjigiyev's Buryat Shamanic and Pre-Shamanic Terms, which was published by Nauka in 1978. He worked almost exclusively from published material, as well as some oral histories that he collected about pre-Soviet practices. And he explicitly says he wants to analyze shamanism as a religious system. And he does rehearse that same class-based argument that I laid out before, right? That it was a clan thing, and then the feudal society developed, and the shamans took over these rituals when class society developed. But Tailgans, which are clan rituals, are cosmological, i.e. folk rituals, and he contrasts those to shamanic healing rituals, which he sees as being like feudal and exploitative, and argues that the relationships established between clans and the environment through rituals change as subsistence patterns change over time. So he fits it into this historical materialist framework. And like slots it into this historical progression, this narrative of historical progression. But at the same time, he focuses on the idea that elemental forces of nature are deities, which enables him to argue that the pre-shamanic Buryat cosmology is part of a larger shared Central Asian ideological system, right? It's sort of a pan-Central Asian cultural sphere. And he has this introductory essay where he lays those things out, and the rest of the book is an encyclopedia. So it just has like terms and definitions, which is a really effective way of collecting really detailed information without endorsing or disapproving of it. Like it's presented as very value neutral, because it's just a dictionary. There's no text explaining any of these practices. So that was sort of a neat kind of way of doing that. Slightly later is Taras Mikhailov's From the History of Buryat Shamanism, which was published in 1980. Mikhailov had previously annotated a bibliography of texts in 78 and a monograph on the relation of Lamaism and Christianity to shamanism in 79, but this text is the one that's most commonly cited. A biography commemorating his work credits his interest in shamanism to an encounter with the famous Hungarian scholar Diószegi, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but who, because of his position in Hungary, was able to sort of cross the borders and both work in the Soviet Union and in the West. And I think his friendship with Diószegi is one of the reasons why Mikhailov is one of the only authors whose work was actually translated into English. So he appears in these like Soviet, Marjorie Balzer was part of a journal that translated Soviet anthropology and archaeology into English. And so some of Mikhailov's work was published in that already in the early 80s. His introduction is a beautiful study in Soviet rhetoric. He divides up the theoretical from the practical. And from a theoretical perspective, he argues that it's only under Soviet power that science has developed enough to understand, the importance of culture and shamanism as a phenomena. And then he cites Lenin to argue that something can only be understood if you look at it as a whole, as a holistic phenomena. And Buryat culture and history can't be understood without the history of shamanism because, Lenin says we have to look at this whole thing as a whole. So he uses Lenin actually to argue that religion is integral to culture, which stands in direct opposition to the presumption that underlies most anti-religious policy for the nationalities, which is that you have to separate them out so that you can eradicate religion and the culture can actually develop. So it's a neat little rhetorical thing that he does there. And he then backtracks pretty quickly from that potentially risky theoretical statement by reiterating that the practical relevance of what he's looking at is to get rid of superstition in popular culture. And again, argues that shamanism arose out of ancient Pan-Central Asian animist ideas. This same sort of sort of Central Asian, they don't use the word Eurasian, but I'm sort of wondering if that's part of the backdrop. And it's tempting to read these introductions as ideological band-aids in a sense that they sort of slap onto material to protect it. But I think that's a little bit too facile. The state did actually want this material, right? Binns, Lane, and Schnirelman all document how anti-religious activists were using descriptions of Russian folk rituals to design Soviet rituals, like secular state practices, like Maslenitsa, Ivan Kupalo, and in Buryatia, Sukharban, right, which became state-sponsored and developed in the late Soviet period as like a sports festival without all of its pre-existing kind of religious emphasis. And both for Christian and in the Buryat case, right, pre-Christian and pre-Buddhist rituals are in effect safer, right, because they're not linked to institutional religions, right? You can argue this is cultural heritage rather than an institutional religion that might in some way conflict with the state. And I think what's really interesting is to sort of see them as academics who are both committed to good scholarship, the same way that we're academics whose interests are shaped by their advisors, who have to learn how to fit things into the right terminology to apply for funding and get published. And at the same time are influenced in certain ways by their material, right? So it's this like give and take between the two. And a search for safe historical sources, for example, inadvertently reveals a long history of Buryat scholarship. Details about these scholars' lives under the Russian Empire and conversations with other post-colonial scholars at international conferences like the Bandung Conference, they would have countered these narratives about how life for minority nationalities under the Soviet Union is better than it was under the Tsarist state. So these things raise maybe doubts and questions, but then without disrupting the existing academic discourse. But it does shift over time. So by 87, when Galdanova, who was Gerasimova's student, as far as I know, published the pre-Lamas beliefs of the Buryat, right, all of the sort of class arguments are completely gone. That's been completely pushed back. She does sort of note the importance of Soviet ethnography to conducting scientific atheist work. But she really places shamanism in a historical context, not a Marxist one, not this historical materialism, but just actually going through the historical sources of, a lot of the historical sources are by like Buddhist missionaries that are writing about shamanic rituals in order to get rid of them. She argues in the introduction, right, that she's interested in recreating a past cosmology, right? The word everyone uses is пережитки, right? Like things that are survivals. But the details of the rest of the book describe rituals that are anything but survivals, right? These are really rich descriptions of practices that you kind of assume have to sort of still be going on in order for her to be able to write about them like this. So there's definitely been a shift. She goes through a survey of written sources on Mongolian and Buryat rituals that reaches back to accounts from Genghis Khan's court. She goes back to like the secret history of the Mongols. She looks at Buddhist monks, things written by Buddhist monks. And most of the sources are actually by outsiders, right? There's not stuff written by shamans. But at this point, when Galdanova is writing this, it's clearly a religion with a long textual history and a rich cosmology. Right, and she very explicitly argues that these are cultural habitual, right, bытовые elements that existed rather than religious ones, and the ritual expresses above all the needs of the people to preserve national originality, samobытность, right? So she's very clearly already presenting this as cultural heritage. And again, makes this argument about Central Asian peoples. So we're almost through. 2 years later, the Berlin Wall comes down. Boris Yeltsin told the republics to take as much sovereignty as they could swallow. And all these things that seemed like esoteric academic publications rapidly became refigured as sources for the, quote, spiritual revival of the nation. Dugarov, who wrote this book, was clearly researched earlier, but was published in 91, and Mikhailov were the key organizers of a 1991 All-Buryat Congress for the consolidation and spiritual rebirth of the nation that they held symbolically during Tagalgan, during White Month for the Lunar New Year, which had been banned in the later years of the Soviet Union. So they positioned it specifically for that. And a lot of the speakers at that conference posited shamanism as a source of spiritual rebirth. They then followed up on that with a conference in 96 on Central Asian shamanism, philosophical, historical, and religious aspects, which brought Buryat, Russian, Mongolian, and a few European scholars, along with locally practicing shamans, to Buryatia and to Lake Baikal to specifically focus on shamanism as an ideology for the spiritual rebirth. So to quote the introduction to the conference proceedings, to bring more so than before attention and respect to the traditional spiritual legacy to their ancient religion and philosophy. So they've got previously unpublished pieces that were collected by these sort of Buryat scholars around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, and essays by the scholars that attended, which included Irina Urbanaeva, who was the editor of the conference proceedings, and also Valentin Khagdaev, who later becomes a shaman, but was at that point a graduate student. Irina Urbanaeva's essay is really interesting. She draws comparisons between claims made by Rurik and Madame Blavatsky to argue that the shamanism of our ancestors is, from the position of the esoteric perspective, the outer form of one of the most ancient world traditions of mysteries that can be called Tengrianstva. And she goes on to compare Greek philosophy, mystical Christianity, Taoism, Buddhism, theosophy, is trying to draw connections with universal symbolism about the sky and the earth, and argues, quote, the spiritual roots of Central Asian civilization are the oldest in the world. And a lot of her rhetoric sounds a lot like those Nauka y Religia articles that are arguing about this natural human capacity for trance. A lot of the language is the same. She keeps calling Buryat shamanism a philosophy, but she's really talking about a cosmology, right? She's talking about which deities and where. There isn't really much in there that one would, in her descriptions of what one might call philosophy. She compares Gesar to Jesus Christ, compares the symbolism of the sky and the earth in Buryat cosmologies to Greek cosmologies. She's clearly working very, very hard to present this as a universal or world religion with a dominant high god, Hukamuhetengri, as sort of a dominant high god, which is not really how he functions in most of the other texts. And rituals that are rife with symbolic interpretations. And although I'm just speculating here, I kind of suspect that the fact that she later took Buddhist monastic vows and gave up becoming a shaman sort of implies that she didn't really feel that her attempt to kind of build this into a philosophy really worked. She gave up on it and ended up converting to Buddhism. Hagdayev also calls shamanism a philosophy, right? He's a graduate student, but he later becomes sort of the head shaman of Olkhon Island. He also calls it a philosophy and focuses on culture heroes in shamanic chants, arguing that national Buryat heroism is an important component of the shamanic culture of Buryats, having the value of historical memory and meaning in the psychocultural code. So again, there's an attempt to kind of like make this into an ideology. And all of them focus on a pan-Central Asian nomadic cultural sphere, which, although I can't prove it, I feel like it has to be in dialogue with sort of a Gumilevian sense of Eurasianism, but it's one that takes Russia out of the picture, right? Russia is not in this at all, right? This is a Central Asian cosmology that doesn't include, like Russia's just not even, they're not explicitly excluded, they're just not mentioned. So I feel like it's sort of probably in dialogue. And they keep arguing that a scholarly reevaluation of these practices will show a deep history of philosophical and theological ideas. However, as my friend Viktor Darjevich noted, right, that's Victor next to, this is the same photo again. Right, the everyday practice of shamanism is too filled with treating patients to lend itself to ideological claims. Victor loved the idea that there was a cosmology and a philosophy in there, but it wasn't something that he had time to devote himself to. And for most nationalist scholars, that claim that shamanism was going to provide an ideology was basically abandoned by the late 1990s. They all stopped making this argument, as far as I can tell. And in academic work, these early nationalist scholars like Shamserana and Tsibikov, and even Banzarov, right, they become kind of like cultural heroes who are the focus of nationalist historiography rather than the shamanic practices. Their attention shifts away from the shamanic practices into this sort of like, I'm going to say hagiography, right? But producing biographies and study and republishing material by these culture heroes from this earlier nationalist movement. Although they failed to find a national ideology in shamanism, I do think this history goes a long way to explaining why Viktor Darjevich wanted to collaborate with scholars like myself, why he was so invested in the idea that I might be able to do that work when he didn't have time for it. I think it also explains to a certain degree why post-Soviet Buryat shamans were so committed to registering themselves as a state-recognized religious organization, despite the fact that the non-institutional nature of the practices is part of what enabled them to survive Soviet repressions. I just thought that was very strange. why are you so committed to registering in a way that's going to potentially put you at risk? And I think it's part of this drive to become a religion on par with universal religions. And I also see that in the claims that they make that shamanism is a universal and genetic human capacity for communicating with spirits, and that the Buryat method can be taught to outsiders. So you're learning to communicate with spirits in the Buryat way, po-buryatsky is the way they phrase it, but this is a universal human capacity that everyone potentially has. So there's definitely like a deep conviction on the part of the Tengri shamans, at least, that this is a universal human religion. And I do think that the popular discourse by and about shamans was deeply influenced by the secular ideas about what ideology is, what philosophy is, what a religion ought to look like in the Soviet period. But that is very, very different from the way the actual embodied ritual practices, which unfortunately I'm going to talk about in different chapters that I'm not presenting today. Those embodied practices that grew out of these texts end up reinscribing profoundly non-secular ways of being in the world. They don't look like ideologies, but they are producing something very different, a different way of sort of engaging with the self and the community and the world, but not in a way that sort of works as an ideology. So just as there was throughout the USSR, there is a big gap between sort of ideological discourse and everyday practice. And I feel like that gets carried into the way shamanism gets revived afterwards. Thank you. I know.
No, it's very interesting.
I still leave that picture up. It's nice,
Yeah.
right? It's
So you can raise your hand and introduce yourself. If you have questions, yeah, please.
Jane Burbank. Well, I've got lots of questions, but I'll start with this one. So how do you see Caroline Humphrey's work now after so many years on your part working in this area? I mean, her original text, even before she rewrote it, I mean, did have quite a strong thesis about why religion in the Soviet context. But how do you think back on Humphrey's work?
I mean, so as I remember, her main thesis is sort of like that shamanism is really useful in in the Soviet system because it helps to mitigate these sort of inevitable cracks between ideology and actual practice. And I think that's a really compelling argument. I have a really hard time. It's really hard when you're talking to people involved in these practices to separate their rhetorical arguments in relation to a particular point that they're making from like an oral history, right? So people will make very dramatic claims about how all of the tradition was broken, right? But then it very clearly wasn't. So I do think there was a lot of practicing going on. I think a lot of that varied depending on where you were. So I have a friend who, is from a very small village. The head of the collective farm was the cousin of the local shaman, right? This is a place where practices could pretty much persist in an unbroken way. And the current shamanic practices are directly sort of connecting. The people at Tengri are predominantly urban people who are much further away from those everyday practices. And there's a big difference between the kind of stuff that they do, which is making this national argument, versus the kind of everyday stuff that I think did persist and which Caroline Humphrey was describing. And I think her argument remains compelling and right. I mean, from what I can tell, the Buryat shamanic organizations in Buryatia are not necessarily setting themselves like in conversation with the state. But there's that Sakha shaman who's been like walking to Moscow to exorcise the Kremlin. Right, so this idea of shamanism engaging with the cracks in the system and providing an alternative language for thinking about power, I think is still valid. It's still there. But I do think there's a big gap between the kind of village practices that she was looking at and documenting on the collective farm versus this kind of urban revival, which is much less connected to those everyday roots. Does that kind of address it? Yeah. Yeah, and also, I mean, her work is just really cool.
Wonderful.
So for our online audience, if you have questions, you can type it and, okay, let's see. Any questions?
It was really interesting. I appreciate, but it's
Thank you.
my really important part of our heritage.
Mhm.
And I'm curious, have you ever been on individual shaman session?
For
with
me
yourself,
personally,
yes.
no, I haven't. I have had one of the members of Tengri, while her ongons were in her, like we sort of asked for a fortune, and I got a fortune from her ongon as part of one of the larger talguns, but I've never had like a session just for me. No, not yet. And I would love to go back and do that, and it's not really possible right now. But maybe with some of the people that have come to America.
I'm sure, right?
Question. So this, what you mentioned at the end about this pan Central Asian, so how does it say, Central Asiatsky, what word do they use?
Yeah, Central Asiatsky, yeah.
So this pan Central Asian cultural, whatever,
Mhm.
heritage or
Mhm.
world, right?
Mhm.
And shamanism as part of it, or
Mhm.
one of the manifestations of that connection, right?
Mhm.
So you said this kind of rhetoric appears in the 1990s,
Mhm.
and Russia is excluded, or kind of Russian history is sort of not mentioned.
Not even mentioned, yeah.
So I wonder
Yeah.
if you look at the last 10 years, for example, is it the same? Is it the same rhetoric of this pan Central Asian, or is it muted?
I think it's muted. I mean, I haven't been
Because it's also
following this
relatively safe.
much. Yeah.
I think it would be
I
relatively
don't
safe.
really know. It's a really
Yeah.
interesting question. I know that like in like Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, there's like a certain discourse about Tengrianstva as like a philosophy. And sometimes some of the shamans I've worked with have used the word Tengrianstva, but it's not really very well developed as like an idea. It's sort of like, yeah, and they named the organization obviously Tengri. But the everyday practice is much more focused on ancestors, on ongons, and local sort of place spirits, Hazian Miasta, and sort of slightly larger like Bukhabatar, Bukhanoyon, like local ancestral beings. And when I've asked about it, Tengri is sort of so far away that he's not, this isn't really, it's like this vague sort of high deity that isn't involved in things, so.
I just from social media, I have the feeling that Sakha, they emphasize
Yes.
it much more.
They emphasize it much
And
more,
Sakha really
yes.
connects with Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, the Pan-Asian, or parts of the Pan-Eurasian. And Tengri is very important that it's a connecting sort of element. But it feels like Buryats are not participating in that much.
Not
I
really, no.
think this comparison, right, between Sakha and Buryatia, that the kind of different discourse. I think it's a very productive way to compare these two places.
Yeah,
And
in Sakha, it's much more of like,
right. So,
it's really strange. It's also a little bit more ideological. Like it's more of a sort of explicit kind of ideology, which isn't really happening in Buryatia.
Is not happening. I think you mentioned
Interesting.
You offered one answer is
Mhm.
that Buddhism is too strong.
Could be, could be.
But also this is related to the question of the indigenous people, right? That someone really claims that the indigenous people, while
Mhm.
Buryats are kind of hesitant to.
They're kind of on the fence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this kind of
Um,
being indigenous and promoting shamanism as international, not really, maybe religion, right? I think they're going hand in hand together. So this.
I think you're right. Yeah, I would agree with that. I found that in shamanic circles and shamans themselves are much more likely to call themselves indigenous, like Borani Narode, or to talk about like, to use we, like we, when they're talking about other indigenous groups. Whereas people in Buddhist contexts really resist that and are much closer, much more focused on being either an independent sort of Asian nation, nationality, or a Mongolian diaspora, right? So Buddhism pushes people that way, and so maybe because Buddhism is slightly more dominant, people are less comfortable with that language. But it is really interesting because it's very, very vibrant in the Altai, I think, also with Borkhanism and Tengrianstva and Saha, and it's sort of interesting that it's not really developed in Buryatia.
It's not very dominant in Buryatia.
Not that people deny the relationships with Central Asia, but I feel like they're much more focused on Mongolia.
Mongolia.
Hi, my name is Leona. I'm from Buryat, and when I was in high school, I had a talk about ecological traditions in shamanism. So since that, I haven't had any opportunity to look at shamanism from the scientific point of view. So that was a great pleasure for me right now to see you, to hear you. So thank you. It's I will share your research with my relatives, so they will be very surprised. I guess because it's a very internal and very personal part of our community. So it was a great surprise for us that some people is interested in that, and you gave us a sort of very high qualified and very well known point of view from outside to our community and to our culture. So thank you.
I would never connected the Soviet academia with shamanism, so it was really interesting.
I was kind of surprised how many publications were actually produced in the 70s and 80s. You wouldn't expect it. But so what you're talking about, this sort of like, it's very personal, it's family based, it's about your relation to your hometown and your family and kin, and right, the whole family gets back together at the place where you're from, right? Those are embodied practices in the rituals that don't abstract well. They don't work as like this. So I feel like the academics wanted to make that into a philosophy, but it's a different kind of, it's very powerful, but it's embodied, right? It has to do with effective relationships with kin. It has to do with, your homeland and where you're from and your family in a way that doesn't work as an ideology in the way that people trained under the Soviet system would expect, right? You can't pull it out as dogma.
Right. It's an institution, but it's not political or institutional. It's about culture and sociology.
And I do think it very powerfully, you raised the question of ecology, right? I do think it's very powerful in terms of how it shapes people, like what kind of awarenesses of the world, what kind of relationships you think are important. And it's very, at least with a lot of the shamans that I've talked to, right, I think modernity, Western philosophy, but also Marxism is very much about like the autonomous individual. I, the single person, will make my decisions and go,
Yeah.
create my fate, right? Whereas a shamanic self is enmeshed in family relations, in obligations, in like illnesses can strike multiple people. One person doesn't do the right rituals and 5 other relatives get sick, right? So you're never a single person, right? You're very much part of like a kin group that's there. And that is a very powerful, different way of being in the world, but it's not an ideology, right? It's an embodied sense of being that I think, right, is very different from what they were looking for when they were doing this work.
I
Yeah.
have a question from the, so you have more questions?
Anyway, thank you for coming.
So we have a question from Natalia Tugulova. You can unmute yourself. Natalia? Yeah,
Should be able to unmute.
yes,
Yeah.
now, yeah.
Now I think everything is working, right?
Yes, we can
Yes.
hear you.
Yeah, so good evening, everyone. And also, I'm also from Buryatia. So I guess we are somewhat even flattered with your interest in our culture, and it's a great honor. And so a bit of a history for me. I come up from a family of shamans. My parents were initiated a few years ago, both of them, as well as my aunt, as well as my great grandpa's brother, and my best friend. He has been a shaman since high school, which is almost absurd. And I have myself experienced, I have experienced this crazy in my head, in my experience, crazy uprise of shamanism. Yeah, I do have a lot of questions and interest in that field myself, but what I wanted you to ask, since when you were doing your field work, you were mostly in contact with Tengri. And I wanted to ask if you have noticed or heard that you said that they're just one of 7, not aware myself. Well, we call them more like communities or unions of shamans. Have you noticed that there is a big competition, somewhat even war between them?
Yeah, I mean, war is maybe a little extreme, but yes, there's a lot of competition. And there's also something about the way in which urban shamanism is being institutionalized that I think is pushing to kind of like purify one version as, and then everybody argues like my way is the real way and that person's way is not the real way, in a way that flattens out a lot of regional differences. The kind of shamanism that was practiced in Aga and Aginsky Okrug is very different from what was practiced in Irkutsk Okrug and like around Lake Baikal. There are different practices, different ways of going into trance, different ongons. And instead of saying, oh, that's this local practice versus that one, people tend to argue, no, this is the right one and your practice is wrong. And some of that is also economic competition, right? They're competing for resources.
Do you think they have a right to claim that their way is a right one? Because there are so many subcultures in Buryatia, and my grandpa's brother, well, they're from Irkutsk, so he practices in Irkutsk way, and my mother is Tatar, and she's trying to practice in Tatar way. So is there really even a right to claim that there's only one universal?
I mean, there's, in a practical sense, right? I as an ethnographer don't want to weigh in and say like, this is the right way, this is the wrong way. Like that's not my place to do that. And there's no overarching power, right? That's part of what within without this kind of institution, the way you have in Christianity or in Buddhism, right? There's no, I don't know why I'm looking at the screen, right? But there's no sort of power to say this is, this is the right way, this is the wrong way. I think Buryat Shambhalovich would very much like to claim that power. I think a lot of shamans would like to be the authority who gets to say that. And I don't think I think it's kind of a shame, because I think that the differences and the creativity and the flexibility of the tradition is part of what makes it powerful, right? It can adapt to different situations, it adapts to different illnesses, to what different clients need, what different patients need. Right, and when you start codifying that in an institutional form, you lose some of that flexibility. And so I do think it's a shame that is sort of, that people are arguing about the right and the wrong way to do it. I do feel like they feel, at least the shamans that I've worked with, largely feel that they kind of have to have an institutional form in order to rebuild what they're trying to rebuild. And I think the institutional form kind of brings that competition with it. So I personally, I don't think there's one right way to do it. There's lots of regional differences, and even personal differences, right? Because everybody has to negotiate a different relationship with their own spirits. So the flexibility is sort of part of what makes it a compelling and vibrant tradition. And I am a little scared that that's being, we might be losing that in this push towards institutionalization. But that said, my job as an anthropologist is just to kind of document what's happening, right? I don't want to weigh in and say this guy's right and that guy's wrong. Like, they would love for me to do that. But I feel like that's not a good thing to do. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Any other?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have one question.
Mhm.
I'm also from Buryat, and I have a question about roots of shamanism. Is connected with Chingism or with Zoroastrianism, or what kind of people? Sunni, Iranian people, or Turkic people, or Tungusic? Or it's mix of all of them.
I don't know. I can't answer that.
Course,
Everybody claims a different route for a different reason. And everybody's really invested in trying to like claim this ancient heritage for it, but they reach to different things. And I don't know that we're ever actually going to be able to answer that. I'm not sure how we would. But
So sometimes people say to me that our shamanism is look like Turkic Chingism or Chingism in Mongolian Empire.
Mhm.
So, but I know name of our one of gods, Tengri gods. His name is Hurmazda Tengri. So it look like to Ahura from Zoroastrianism, Iranian people. So
Yeah.
I think it's kind of mixes a lot of cultures.
I think so too. I mean, for the most part, I don't ask questions about these origins because they're so long ago, and I'm not sure how you would answer it. But I do think it makes sense that there would be a lot of traditions that come together, because Buryatia was an offshoot of the Silk Road, right? Buryatia was enmeshed in trading networks that took tea and honey and fur and things all over Central Asia, right? So it makes sense that they might have met Zoroastrians and said, hey, we have something similar, and compared it. I know that there's also Korean arguments that Buryat shamanism is ancestral to Korean shamanism. The guys at Tengri are very fond of the idea that this was a court religion under Genghis Khan. I don't know how you would prove any of it, but globalization is not new, and this part of Asia was a crossroads with people bringing things, from one end of the continent to another. So I think there is probably a lot of exchange and that came through these trade networks, probably. So choose your own past. Like, pick the one that you like.
I have a question about
Mhm.
gender.
Uh-huh, yes.
So particularly, you talked a little bit about this late Soviet Buryat scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a gender factor there or not? Like maybe they were more predominantly women, or it's more like evenly distributed between male and female scholars? Because it tends to be that university professors mainly were women.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, teachers, it's
Yeah.
known, right? The teachers,
Yeah.
teachers were mostly women. I don't know about the university, but you didn't kind of didn't think about that.
It's not, it's a really interesting question that I have to pay more attention to.
It's very, yeah, I'm looking at this picture, they're all men.
Yeah,
it's very
is a very masculine place.
Yeah.
So Manjai Boyandelgar writes about Buryat shamans in Mongolia and the transition from the Soviet period into the post-Soviet, and that there's a big gender shift with shamans, right? During the Soviet period, most of the big shamans were women because the state wasn't paying as much attention. Sort of politics is a male realm, and shamanism was at home, and so it was the realm of women. And then in the post-Soviet, that switches really dramatically, and it's mostly men who become like the bigger, more powerful shamans. In terms of, I mean, there's a lot of female scholars. I mean, and especially so Ksenia Gerasimova, a lot of her students, Galdanova was one of the big names in this. I do still think a lot of the like people who ended up directing research institutes were men. That's just sort of a gut instinct. But in terms of the texts I've seen, like the books that I've seen, maybe slightly more men than women, but not a huge difference. And the men tend to be the ones that, I mean, specifically Dugarov and Mikhailov are like the two that end up being held up as like, these are the authorities. But I don't know. It's interesting. It's an interesting question.
I just imagine that maybe these people who want to have as an institution, right? They are men and women still in rural areas and villages, people who actually perform those rituals. Maybe they are predominantly women. I don't know.
There are maybe a lot of women in the organization. The leadership was mostly men, but their sort of sister organization in Aga is led by a woman. The first organization, Bomorgo, was founded by Nadia Stepanova, who was a student of a male shaman from the Baikal, like area, like the shores, you know, near Baikal. But she was the one who founded the first organization, actually. And I think the leaders of both, like an organization in Irkutsk and in Aginsky Okrug are both women. And we're very powerful shamans. So I do think it is much harder for women to go through the process of being initiated just because women do more work, right? People have day jobs or they have disability payments. But so women on top of a day job also have like childcare and family care. So it's easier for men to go through the work that it takes to be initiated. But there are a number of very powerful female shaman, like directors of organizations. So I'm a little hesitant to kind of sharply gender it. There was some resentment also between like women and men in the organization as well. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Was that a question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Amel. I'm not from Buryat, I'm from Kazakhstan, so might not be that attuned. It seems like your research is very like around the I don't know, like Joseph Roach kind of idea of substitution or surrogation and performance of cultural memory, and how in some ways they actually one myth has to go side by side for another to emerge and also get a certain friction. He looks into like Mardi Gras kind of performance in many ways, but more like even like a contemporary kind of way of like contestation, different ways of shamanism and who's the right one. And in some ways they need to, it's both institutionalized, but it's also like seems different at that point also cultural kind of memory within them raises. But my question is like more, I guess maybe also the idea of like stewardship, environmental stewardship, how like different maybe ways organizations is it described in it? There's like a care system or not? And then you also said that like each of them have different sila miasta, right? So yeah. Just maybe does that itself, like spatial kind of orientation or understanding, also shape the practices?
Yes. Yes, but in complicated ways. Part of the reason why I work at a very small university where we have a lot of interdisciplinary stuff because there's only so many of us. So you end up having a lot of interdisciplinary conversations. And I've been getting increasingly involved with the College of the Environment, in part because they find the idea of like these Khasian Miesta to be really interesting, right? And there is a very popular interest, I think, in the US as well for like, oh, animism is like a different way of relating to the environment. And I've written a little bit about the problems with that. And so I do think that especially in the village contexts, these are practices that are very place-based, right? Your ancestors are in the village that you're from, members of the family go back to that village. And I hope I'm not stereotyping, but a lot of the people that I know in Buryatia will talk about themselves as being from a particular area, right? Yeah, Barbuzinskaya Buryatka, right? Even if they were born in Ulan-Ude, but their ancestors are from there, right? So there is a very strong sense of where you're from matters to who you are, that you need to be connected to that place and have a good relationship with those ancestors that are also embedded, like the ancestors are in the place, right? And the language, right? It's so much of it. I did most of my field work in Russian, right? So then you have like Bukhabatar живет здесь in Russian, is like Bukhabatar lives here. But in Buryat, I think it's like Bukhabatar Beidek, right? Like Bukhabatar this is Bukhabatar kind of. I'm not sure how to translate it. My Buryat's terrible. But right, so it's very place-based. And in that sense, it seems like it has potential for certain environmental consequences, and I do think there are very strong affective ties to places, and that may be something that's developing, especially in the local stuff. I don't think that at least the practices that I saw by urban shamans rebuilding these things are not specifically focused on environmental questions. And they actually like cut down massive numbers of birch trees to do ceremonies. It's not right, and people leave offerings at roadside shrines where like Khasian Miasta are sort of these sort of really roadside obos, right? And they become like trash piles in a sense in a lot of cases. So that may be changing over time. I think maybe the prevalence of forest fires is maybe also like galvanized a kind of a little bit more concern, but I guess what I've said in other talks is like, I do think it leads to a relationship where land and place and these spirits that live in the land are kin. But just because they're family, like people have dysfunctional families. And I think in a lot of cases, these are still kind of dysfunctional families. Like it hasn't really manifested yet so much. And there's just a lot of undoing of, right? I mean, this overall socialism and the way in which, right, production and extraction of resources, it was really central to the Soviet system. So I think, you know, like here, you can change sort of like your orientation a little, but like people are still very much embedded in institutions that are based on a sort of very materialist form of extraction. So it hasn't really crystallized. Yeah, sorry.
Well,
Um,
hopefully this environmental awareness and concern for the environment will be next, just beyond healing, right?
We talk a lot
Yeah.
about it a lot, but I don't know that it's really like turned into anything.
Let's hope.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, political situations are complicated,
Yeah.
right? People only have so much energy to do
Yeah,
what
yeah.
can be done.
I
Yeah.
have a probably last question, if there is no one want to ask question. Okay, I have one, we have like one couple of minutes left. Despite all the, internal conflicts and competition and, not being concerned with the environment, I like this, how you finish is that there is this impulse, at least there was this impulse to go beyond the national, right, or beyond Buryatia, and that there is shamanism can be taught. So it's not very narrowly nationalistic sort of kind of mindset, right? So the shamanism can be taught. There is kind of universal sort of not message, universal application, right? Applicability to beyond Buryatia. So now as a scholar, right, as an anthropologist of and studying the shamanism and Buryat shamanism, do you think that it could be something useful for people who are doing out at other places, like Korean shamanism, right? Are there anything that can be any points of convergence, of any points of discussion? Right?
That's
I'm
a
just-
really big question.
I'm just trying to take out, Buryatia, history of Buryatia, or history of Buryat religion.
Yeah.
Outside of this very narrow field. I don't want us to be just about Buryat. I want other people to know about Buryatia. And so how what these people can learn or kind of think like, oh, this is a very interesting way of, relating to nature or to the past, and you see some.
Yeah.
You don't need.
No,
probably no answers.
I think
Yeah.
sort of. I mean, I am very, right, as someone who grew up in America and before I went back to grad school, I worked in repatriation with Native American stuff that's in American museums. Right. So the question of like appropriating indigenous rituals is very fraught, right? There's a long history of sort of like stealing, and some of my other research is sort of about New Age practices and this sort of, colonial, like, I'm gonna go in and learn how to be a shaman, and I went to the Amazon for 2 weeks and now I can do a healing. And it's very, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, I think, like in this example, Mikhailov gets interested in this in part, supposedly, because there is a foreigner who thinks this is interesting, right? And so you revalue your own thing. And that's cool, but it's also, right, it becomes this global marketplace where people come to buy initiations. Right, they do argue, at least when I was there, and the discourse may have changed, when I was there was a sense of like, you might have a calling and we can teach you how to use that. It was very different from the kind of like more Harner Foundation, Western, like anyone can learn to become a shaman for personal fulfillment, right? That they're absolutely not on board with that. Right? Only certain people have a calling, and if you do, right, it comes with certain obligations, and that remained part of it. I guess what is interesting, or what I feel like could transfer, is especially with these questions of like of environmental questions about how do we relate to the environment, how do we relate to our community, how do we find a system that isn't rooted in extractive sort of and often very dysfunctional sort of social forms. capitalism, you know, and all the ways in which that leads us to not care about our families and our kin and our communities. People often look at shamanism and they think about shamanism as something that people way off in Siberia do, that they do deep in the jungles of the Amazon, right? That's very, very different, right? But this is a community of people who were educated as part of the Soviet Union for 100 years, right? The guys that are rebuilding, like you know, Budishab and Victor, they were Komsomol members. They were raised atheists. They have degrees from Russian scientific institutions, right? So they're not that different from people in America who are saying, I want to find a new way to relate to the environment, but you know, I have to change my habits, right? Like they've transformed their lives in really powerful ways. And they're not, you know, they weren't necessarily born into a small village where this was always practiced, right? They're sort of rebuilding something.
I see.
And I guess that is the part that I think is interesting about here, because this isn't somewhere that's like off in the Amazon, right? People in Ulaanbaatar live just like people in New York, right? Not exactly, but like, you know, in apartment buildings and with jobs and cell phones and right. So like, and they're changing that orientation slowly, right? Very slowly. And it hasn't fully, you know, it's not necessarily like, as one of the questioners said, there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of arguments, but it does sort of, I guess, offer a comparison that it is possible to rebuild some of those things, I suppose. Does that actually make sense?
No, it's very nice, I see it now,
So that's part of why I find Buryat really interesting, right? Because it's not like a lot of, you know, there's this whole ontological turn in anthropology about like alternate worldviews, but they're always talking about groups that they kind of imagine. They're like, but everybody's part of the same modernity, right? So so I guess that would be kind of like the interesting parallel here.
All right, thank you so much,
you.
Skin.
Yeah. And
Thank you.